Ahead and get started. I'm Daphne Gallagher. I'm in the Anthropology Department. I'd like to welcome everyone to our first African Studies lecture series talk of the spring term. I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Tappan. Dr. Tappan comes to us from Portland State University. She's in the Department of History there. She received her PhD in 2010 from Columbia University, and she's an Africanist historian who focuses on a variety of topics related to medicine, nutrition, policy, colonial and post-colonial transitions, all sorts of very interesting topics. And her primary area of focus is in East Africa, where she's been working in Uganda for many, many years. Dr. Tappan has several really exciting-looking forthcoming publications. She has a book chapter coming out in Global Health in Africa, Historical Perspectives on Culture, Epidemiology, and Control. Her chapter is The True Fiasco, the Treatment and Prevention of Severe Acute Malnutrition in Uganda from 1950 to 1974. And she has an article coming out in a special edition of the International Journal of African Historical Studies on the history of medicine in East Africa. That was actually in part organized by Melissa Greyboys, who's also one of the organizers of this lecture series. And that article is Blood Work and Rumors of Blood, Nutritional Research and Insurrection in Buganda from 1938 to 1952. And today, Dr. Tappan is going to be talking to us about A Healthy Child Comes from a Healthy Mother, Malnutrition and Motherhood in Buganda from 1935 to 1974. So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming and join me in welcoming Dr. Tappan.
Well, I wanted to start by, of course, thanking you for coming to hear my talk and for this opportunity to share my work. Especially, I wanted to thank Daphne Gallagher and also Melissa Greyboys, who Melissa can't be here today because she's on her way to Atlanta for a conference, which is actually where I'm headed this evening. So I'll see her tomorrow morning. But I also wanted to say that I feel really honored to be included in this African Studies lecture series, and it's a real honor to be here. There are a couple of caveats to my talk that I wanted to make at the very outset. And that is that the main title of my talk, A Healthy Child Comes from a Healthy Mother, is a tiny bit misleading, or I found that it's misleading. And that is that I'm not going to be talking about the health of mothers today. That was not the predominant focus of the nutritional program that my work focuses on, and so it won't be the focus of my talk today. Instead, the focus was primarily on the health of young children and the role of mothers in the prevention of malnutrition. But I'll say more about the title of the talk as I proceed. The other thing that I wanted to say before I really got started was that the main part of my talk encompasses what I consider my more substantiated and verified findings that are based on a fairly wide variety of documentary and oral sources. But there's a part of my talk towards the end, the part that deals with the dynamic history of motherhood, that is a bit more speculative and preliminary. And this is the center of the work that I'm doing right now, the work that I will be doing when I return to Uganda this summer. So I just thought I'd be very upfront about that. Okay, so the nutritional work that was conducted in Uganda during the period under consideration, namely the 1930s through the 1970s, concerned a form of severe acute malnutrition known as kwashiorkor. Now, severe acute malnutrition is the most serious and fatal form of childhood malnutrition. Current global estimates indicate that the condition contributes to a significant proportion of annual deaths in children under the age of 5, with approximately 10 million children affected. The condition encompasses a range of severely malnourished states that in the period that we're thinking about today, the period that I'm going to talk about, were thought to be two distinct conditions. And that isn't really the way we think about it anymore, but in the period that I'm talking about, this was relevant. So the two distinct conditions are kwashiorkor and marasmus. And whereas marasmus, a child with marasmus is in essence starving, right, and exhibits the extreme and highly visible wasting of both muscle and fat, the kind of classically starved child where you can see the ribs, for instance. A child with kwashiorkor was thought to be suffering from a form of malnutrition attributed to a diet deficient in protein. The most important and consistent symptom of kwashiorkor was the edema. which is the accumulation of fluid in the tissues that gave severely malnourished children a swollen and fatty appearance. The telltale swelling was exacerbated by an extensive fatty buildup beneath the skin and in the liver. Many of the children with kwashiorkor developed a form of dermatosis, in which the skin simply peeled away, and they often lost the pigment in their hair. One of the most distressing aspects of the condition was the extent to which children with kwashiorkor suffered. They were visibly miserable, apathetic, and anorexic. Their refusal to eat further contributed to their impaired ability to digest food and led to the excessive mortality that was considered characteristic of the condition. The specific cause or set of causal factors that lead to kwashiorkor remain uncertain today, and the condition continues to have a relatively high case fatality. Yet beginning in the mid-1930s, physicians and scientists working in Uganda conducted research on kwashiorkor that appeared to determine the cause of the condition. This work led to the development of the first highly effective curative therapy, and Uganda then became one of several international research centers devoted to better understanding the condition in order to prevent it. The predominant focus on prevention culminated in the establishment of Africa's first nutrition rehabilitation program, which quickly became known as the Mwanamujimu Nutrition Rehabilitation Unit, from the first word in a Luganda proverb, Mwanamujimu ava kuongozi, which is commonly translated to mean a healthy child comes from a healthy mother. Now, my work examines this long history of nutritional research, focusing upon the development of therapeutic measures, the development of the Mwanamujimu program, and its first rural outreach at the Lutete Health Center, which is a rural health center situated approximately 30 miles north of Uganda's capital city, Kampala. And both Lutete and Kampala are well within the heart of the South Central Kingdom of Buganda, which became the economic, political, and medical center of British colonial rule in Uganda. Now, the central aim and argument of my presentation today is to critically examine this triumphalist and celebratory narrative of scientific discovery, program development, and biomedical advance. Doing so allows us to consider an alternative narrative, which reveals that in addition to metropolitan and international mandates, physicians and scientists were forced to respond to local rejection, receptivity, and interpretation of their work. So insisting that local engagement served as an important, if overlooked, catalyst in shifting biomedical practices and programs decenters biomedical efforts in order to reveal an entangled ethos, an entangled ethics, and an evolving approach to health and well-being in Buganda. Here, social history and the history of biomedicine become impossible to disentangle. Yet my objective goes beyond recognizing the role of local women and men in the initial development and sustainability of the Mwanamujimu program. Instead, I think this points us to an important finding, which is that the Mwanamujimu program met with such remarkable success because it inadvertently became part of shifting ideas and practices of motherhood in Buganda. Now, although I will only have time to briefly consider this point today, I think it is worth noting that much ink has been spilled on the history of colonial and missionary efforts to domesticate African women and reform African forms of motherhood. And for good reason. There's a good reason for there to have been a lot of work on this. Yet my work suggests that more work must be done to understand how African women and African men interpreted and incorporated these efforts on their own terms and according to already dynamic social ideologies of motherhood in Buganda. Okay, so the early period of kwashiorkor research was characterized by desperate attempts to determine the cause of the condition in order to develop effective therapies. Yet prior to the early 1950s, kwashiorkor treatment proved elusive. In the absence of effective treatment, mortality rates were alarming. Dr. Hugh Trowell, a colonial medical officer stationed first in Kenya and then in Uganda, reported losing 3/4 of his kwashiorkor patients in the 1930s and over 40% in the late 1940s. The World Health Organization, in their seminal study of kwashiorkor in Africa, reported mortality rates in 1949 as high as 90%. Such high mortality rates are largely what drove Trowell to devote more than a decade to kwashiorkor research. research that over time involved increasingly extractive procedures. At Malago, Uganda Central Hospital, Trowell set up a private lab and trained a lab assistant, John Chiobe, to examine the liver extracts and blood slides. And during World War II, he enlisted a preeminent graduate of the Makere Medical School, Dr. Elio Muwazi. Now, initially, Trowell's focus was on anemia, and while on home leave, he took a course on anemia and other blood diseases, in addition to traveling via Egypt in order to consult with another physician who had been publishing on anemia. In the course of these and other investigations, Trowell and Muwazi withdrew blood in order to evaluate serum protein levels, which is the amount of protein found in the blood, red blood cell counts, and to test for congenital syphilis. They also conducted a study on the students at Budo and Gayaza high schools, the two most prominent and well-known schools in Uganda. As Dr. Chris Ndugwa recalled during our interview, the students were divided into groups, and after each group was given a different meal for a period of time, Muwazi and Trowell then measured the blood pressure, weight, height, and took blood from each of the students. This work expanded considerably in 1946 when a physiology and biochemistry lab was established on Malago Hill. One of the physicians who came to work in the lab did so specifically to conduct research on anemia. As part of the many investigations conducted by Trowell and his colleagues in the physiology and biochemistry lab, including nitrogen balance studies and extensive serum protein evaluations, they began to obtain samples from young children by extracting blood from the neck. As Muwazi, Trowell, and their colleague Jack Davies explained in the East African Medical Journal in 1947, and I quote, "In all children, blood for serological examination was removed from the jugular vein in the outpatient department. This was done without much difficulty, and it was found to be the method of choice as it required no special preparation. It was found that with a little practice, 3 to 5 cc's of blood could easily be obtained," end of quote. The other main focus of this early phase of nutritional research in Uganda was the liver. The unusual accumulation of fat in the liver caught the attention of researchers from the outset and became an ongoing focus of this research. During World War II, for instance, Trowell sent liver specimens to Sir Harold Hemsworth, the future secretary of the British Medical Research Council. And as Trowell later told his daughter, he used to store these liver specimens in their refrigerator at home. And he would tell his wife, and I quote, "Look, you mustn't let the boys cook this." So I would keep the bit refrigerated until I could take it to the plane in hope that it hadn't gone bad, as you might say, by the time it got to London. I'd put some of it in pickle sometimes, end of quote. Now, as objectionable as pickling liver specimens, keeping them in the refrigerator and sending them to Europe on airplanes may have been, such practices paled in comparison with the liver biopsies that Trowell and his colleagues also performed in this period. A biopsy is a specimen taken from a live patient. And prior to 1947, Trowell could only conduct liver biopsies on adults, as the procedure was too dangerous in young children. Trowell later recalled that together with his colleagues at the Physiology and Biochemistry lab, and I quote again, "We would put them under an anesthetic and would put in a large bore needle with which I could suck a small thread out. I wasn't doing it with as good needles as they have now. We hadn't lost any children. We had lost one adult over this, and this had made me move more cautiously with it, because I hadn't realized how deep you could go in on a thin patient. I had made him bleed, I'm afraid, fatally," end of quote. At a conference, notably after acquiring a special bore needle that allowed him to withdraw a thin thread of liver tissue from young children, Trowell reported having performed liver biopsies on 50 to 60 children. But he noted, quoting again, "Almost invariably, the liver was being pushed forward and that blood collected in the syringe," end of quote. Now, as we will see, the regret that Trowell later expressed when describing the liver biopsies is not altogether surprising in light of the 1949 political insurrection in which Kwashiorkor research appears to have been specifically targeted. As he later told his daughter, quoting again, "We started to do experiments, which at first I didn't realize how dangerous they were, taking blood and doing other things to the liver biopsies and so on. In the end, I thought we've certainly lost one case. We may have lost 2 cases by this investigation. We didn't realize this when I started. So I cooled off and said, we can't go any further with this. We're not getting much information out of it. And really, all this taking of blood and the rest of it is upsetting them too much." Now, the fact that they weren't getting much information from these increasingly extractive procedures meant that they were also making little, if any, headway in the development of effective treatment. Thus, while an increasing number and variety of nutritional studies were conducted leading up to and immediately after the Second World War, that research failed to translate into therapeutic measures capable of reversing the condition or diminishing its high mortality rate. Such extractive procedures were not in any way improving health or benefiting the people of Uganda. Now, nutritional research conducted prior to the development of treatment coincided with a period of political unrest in Uganda, and in particular, a political insurrection in 1949. Now, while it is far beyond the scope of my purpose today to examine the political insurrection in great depth, its relevance warrants a brief discussion. Recent historical analysis has shown that while the insurrection centered upon calls for democracy and free trade, the people who were involved were questioning the political ethics of the ruling Ganda elite. Political unrest mounted in this period due to several factors, including the failure of the colonial state to effectively mitigate wartime inflation, which created great hardship in Buganda. The price controls imposed by cotton and coffee marketing boards served to further aggravate the situation by significantly reducing farming incomes. These economic constraints added to long-standing grievances surrounding the South Asian and expatriate monopoly over marketing, processing, and other commercial ventures. To Uganda, their worsening economic position in the post-World War II period was in many ways seen as a failure of political leadership. The inaction of the Uganda chiefs and officials in response to these economic threats to general well-being made them the explicit targets of the insurrection. The unwillingness of ruling Uganda chiefs to oppose unpopular British policies suggested that their alliances were with the British rather than with the people, and moreover that they were using those alliances for their own personal benefit. As a result, the armed insurrection that erupted in 1949 specifically and exclusively targeted the property and wealth of the South Asian community and elite Uganda who were seen as allied to the British. What is interesting for our purposes is that the biomedical physicians conducting kwashiorkor research were caught up in the events of 1949. In fact, the only African physician involved in this research, Dr. Elio Muwazi, was specifically targeted. His house was destroyed and he feared for his life and the safety of his family. Muwazi was a target during the insurrection because it was reported at the time that people believed he killed children by taking blood. As Professor Alexander Odonga later wrote, and I quote, "The disturbances caused a lot of sufferings to many people and institutions. The research into kwashiorkor and children's anemia was temporarily interrupted by it because doctors concerned were accused of taking a lot of blood from the children for trade," end of quote. Now, my interest today is not in the debate within Africanist historiography over whether or not rumors of blood taking can or should be associated with real events and procedures. What interests me instead is the fact that biomedical personnel and colonial administrators at the time believed that the attack upon Muwazi was due to rumors connected to his kwashiorkor research, which was thereby seen as work that fueled political unrest. So even though they continued to dismiss local objections to highly extractive procedures as irrational suspicion and rumor, these objections were no longer entirely ignored. Kwashiorkor research, as Odonga noted, was immediately, albeit temporarily, suspended, and Trowell was transferred from his position at the head of the pediatric ward. And in the wake of the attack upon Muwazi, further research was forced to proceed with much greater caution. Now, when nutritional work did resume, it did so under the direction of Dr. Rex Dean, an emerging expert in the field of nutritional science. Dean was sent to Uganda by the Medical Research Council with a clear mandate to apply his expertise toward the prevention of kwashiorkor. But from the very outset, there was an explicit emphasis upon ensuring that the future nutritional research did not contribute to political unrest in Buganda. When the Secretary of the Medical Research Council visited Uganda and discussed the prospect of Dean establishing a research unit on Malago Hill, he had to promise the local colonial authorities that Dean would not conduct, and I quote, "school or institutional trials in such a way as to upset susceptibilities," end of quote. And another MRC-sponsored researcher who was already working in Uganda at the time spent several months testing a less invasive method of taking blood and considered relocating to the Gambia due to what she described as, and I quote, "the difficulties created by the political situation and local feeling about blood sampling," end of quote. It was in this context that Dean arrived in Uganda in 1950 and immediately set to work developing an effective form of treatment for kwashiorkor. Despite the fact that Dean was sent to Uganda in order to work towards the future prevention of the condition, his greatest contribution to nutritional science ended up being a highly curative therapy. According to his successor, Dr. Roger Whitehead, Dean turned his attention to the development of kwashiorkor treatment due to the appalling mortality rates that he encountered upon arriving in Uganda. And while I don't dispute that mortality rates were the primary motivation behind the development of effective treatment, it is also true that in the wake of the 1949 insurrection, the future of nutritional research in Uganda depended upon the development of therapeutic evidence that kwashiorkor research translated into palpable benefits for the health and well-being of malnourished children. This perhaps is most evident by the fact that all researchers and physicians at the Infantile Malnutrition Research Unit, which Dean established on Malago Hill, were required to abide by the maxim, no survey without service. Whereas Dean never succeeded in devising a means of preventing severe acute malnutrition, he did succeed in developing a highly effective therapeutic regimen. Dean's therapy involved administering a concentrated milk-based protein formula according to a highly regimented system, not unlike the prescription of drug therapy, wherein a specific amount of the formula had to be ingested at specific intervals throughout the day. Because these children were so sick and anorexic, the initial phase of treatment usually required intragastric tube feeding. And in extreme cases, children were fed through a continuous drip. Secondary infections were so prevalent that it became routine to give daily injections of penicillin in the initial week of treatment, whether or not an infection was evident. Children admitted with severe kwashiorkor were also automatically treated for malaria, anemia, dehydration, and potassium loss. Although early efforts to treat children with blood transfusions indicated that the edema made intravenous therapy extremely dangerous, approximately 10% of the children were so dehydrated that rehydration through the intragastric tube proved inadequate and immediate IV therapy was required. Thus, parents and guardians who brought severely malnourished children to Malago for treatment from the early 1950s onward saw children recover from a severe and highly fatal condition as a result of a highly curative process involving tubes, formulas, syringes, IVs, and injections. These therapeutic measures were very effective. Kwashiorkor went from a typically fatal condition with mortality rates ranging from 40 to 90% to a condition that responded to treatment 80 to 90% of the time. Together with the dramatic fall in mortality rates, the phenomenal pace of recovery and the profound transformation in the child's condition, particularly in the initial phase of treatment, had an impact on local acceptance of kwashiorkor therapy. Even in very severe cases, nearly all of the most pronounced symptoms of kwashiorkor disappeared or began to improve within a week. The anorexia that necessitated the intragastric tube feeding began to subside so rapidly that tube feeding was rarely necessary for longer than 2 days. Children not only recovered their appetite, but the edema also began to immediately dissipate, and even extensive cases of dermatosis started to heal by the end of a week. The apathy and misery associated with the condition quickly subsided, and children reportedly exhibited a healthy curiosity in their surroundings very soon after the initiation of treatment. So by the early 1960s, if not earlier, kwashiorkor treatment at Malago Hospital was in high demand. Unlike the 1930s and 1940s, when it had been necessary to convince mothers to bring their severely malnourished children to the hospital, with many absconding or refusing treatment, the provision of highly effective kwashiorkor therapy became an expectation, with mothers and guardians reportedly traveling hundreds of miles to obtain kwashiorkor treatment at Malago Hospital. In fact, Uganda incorporated a new category of ill health into their lexicon of illness and disease, referring to the conditions so effectively treated in the hospital as chupa disease. And while I don't have time to fully discuss the concept of chupa disease, what I do want to highlight is the active engagement with biomedical therapies that the concept of chupa disease signals, a point that I'll return to in a moment. Chupa was understood as a condition that required the dramatic and highly curative therapies provided in the hospital treatment of kwashiorkor. So prior to the mid-1960s, efforts to prevent kwashiorkor centered upon health education and the formulation of high-protein weaning foods. Both of these efforts failed. Dean worked for over a decade trying to develop a weaning food composed of locally available vegetable proteins to no avail. efforts to teach mothers and guardians of malnourished children that they should stop feeding their children matoke or plantains was, as one physician explained to me, politely rejected by mothers who knew that matoke was actually a good food for their children. The failure of their efforts to prevent the condition was evident to the scientists and physicians working on Malago Hill, as there was no indication of a downward shift in prevalence rates. And more importantly, in their day-to-day clinical work, they increasingly encountered the problem of relapse, meaning that young children who were successfully treated in the hospital for kwashiorkor were brought back again, suffering from the same condition. For biomedical personnel who had been working for years to prevent the condition, the problem of relapse was disheartening, to say the least. Thus, just as prior to his early death in 1964, Dean reportedly cautioned that, and I quote, "We are in danger of knowing more about malnutrition and less about its elimination than anywhere else in the world." The failure of prevention prompted physicians and scientists to begin to reevaluate their approach, and it was out of this critical moment of reflection that they came upon the idea behind the nutrition rehabilitation program. In their analysis, the key problem was, in fact, the hospital itself, as it was increasingly thought that the highly curative framework of the hospital ward did two things. First and foremost, I would argue, it left parents and guardians of malnourished children with the impression that severe malnutrition was a disease that, as we have seen, required a veritable barrage of therapeutic interventions. And second, they believed that the hospital therapy left mothers passive observers of biomedical interventions. In the early 1960s, and in the context of relapse, physicians began to see the growing demand for kwashiorkor treatment as a passive reliance upon curative therapy. And they concluded that in order to prevent kwashiorkor in Uganda, it was necessary to remove kwashiorkor treatment from the curative framework of the hospital ward and place it squarely in the hands of Ugandan mothers. By transforming mothers from passive observers to active participants in their child's recovery and rehabilitation, it was hoped that they would be empowered to manage their future nutritional health. In other words, breaking a pattern of dependency upon hospital treatment required extracting biomedicine and empowering African women. Now, as I've already suggested, I don't agree that the problem was that mothers had been rendered passive observers of biomedical treatment. Rather, the problem was one of active interpretation and incorporation of biomedical therapies according to local ideas and epistemologies. The incorporation of a new category of ill health, Chupa disease, represented an active engagement, not a passive reliance. Nonetheless, the philosophy behind the program was to harness this engagement with biomedical therapy and was partly articulated as using the cure to teach prevention. Through a process in which mothers or guardians of malnourished children prepared and administered the therapeutic formula themselves. Here we go. Thus, mothers were admitted to the nutrition rehabilitation unit together with their sick children, and they remained at the unit for several weeks. Moreover, these women led to the discussions and cooking demonstrations, and newly admitted mothers and visitors to the unit observed as their peers prepared food that they then fed to children who were at various stages of recovery and rehabilitation. It was in this way that a central pedagogy of the program was seeing is believing, the idea being that rather than seeing a physician cure their young children through a barrage of curative therapeutic measures, children would be seen recovering through their mother's or guardian's hands alone. So in addition to removing biomedical personnel from the therapeutic process, and doctors were explicitly forbidden from wearing their white coats or stethoscopes while visiting the unit, it was also considered essential that the ideology and content of the program emerge from local ideas and practices rather than from biomedicine. And this component of the program was taken very seriously and went much deeper than the adoption of the local name Wanamujimu. Instead, great care was taken to build a team of locally appointed staff directed by a Ugandan woman who was originally trained. Oh, that's the wrong. These are images of them doing the cooking demonstrations, and there's the staff. So the staff was directed by a Ugandan woman who was originally trained as a teacher and who had no direct biomedical expertise, and this was true of most of the staff at Wanamujimu. Among the many facets of the program, the concept of chitoburo became the centerpiece of the nutrition education at Wanamujimu. Chitobro was a well-known local dish composed of many types of food and the theme of a popular song on radio stations throughout Uganda and East Africa. Etymologically, chitobro is related to the verb tabula, meaning to stir up or mix, and to conceptions of being mixed up, mingled, muddled, or confused, as well as to chitobeko, meaning a mixture or variegated pattern, as one might find, for instance, in a multicolored mat. In Luganda, the word olutabu was also used to designate soft and bland food, or pap, which is food that's suitable for infants, and was in fact derived from the same verb tabula, to mix or stir up. And while chitobro was not a food that was thought of as solely for young children, it therefore had the added benefit of being, by definition, an appropriate first food for babies and infants. The rich and positive meanings embedded in the concept chitobro highlighted the act of mixing different foods, and recipes for chitobro at Mwanamujimu consisted of either double mixtures of the most common staples, plantains or sweet potatoes, together with vegetable proteins, or triple mixtures that also integrated available sources of fish, meat, or eggs. In keeping with the stipulation that the proposed modifications in feeding practices be kept to an absolute minimum, the preparation of chitobro diverged from common methods of food preparation in only two respects. The first involved mixing the ingredients before they were steamed and mashed, rather than as part of the consumption process. It was in this respect that the concept of chitobro underlined the second innovation, which was to cook the mixed food for young children together with the daily meals, albeit in a separate banana leaf or small lidded pot. Very little emphasis was placed upon the precise combination of the ingredients, and parents were encouraged to make use of any and all food readily available to them in their vibanda or gardens and local markets. What did matter was the dietary components, that the dietary components were mixed in amounts that ensured the consumption of sufficient calories and protein. The key to making chitobro was, as many women and men impressed upon me, to measure the ingredients. In fact, measuring to ensure a balanced mixture was one of the most enduring messages of the Mwanamujimu program. Women who instructed those who were new or visiting the unit demonstrated how to measure 2 handfuls of soaked beans or pounded groundnuts, and to add these ingredients to either 3 fingers of plantain or to a medium-sized sweet potato. The basic unit of measurement employed at Mwanamujimu was the handful. When asked about Mwanamujimu and chitobro, the women and men I interviewed frequently responded by emphatically holding out their open palm in order to illustrate how to measure the high-protein components of the mixture. Their memory of measuring the ingredients reflects the emphasis that was placed upon ensuring a specific ratio of calories and proteins, or as they were known at Mwanamujimu, bodybuilding and filling foods. The extent to which measuring the ingredients has remained a part of their living memory is, I argue, a testament to the perceived efficacy of chitobro in the treatment and prevention of kwashiorkor. As Ephraim Mosoke explained to me when I asked if children in his community continued to suffer from kwashiorkor, that if he saw a malnourished child, he would simply teach the parents how to make chitobro. Mosoke's response touches on the primary aim of the Mwanamujimu program. Just as knowledge of effective kwashiorkor treatment spread throughout the region, increasing local demand for hospital therapy, it was hoped that knowledge of how to make chitobro in order to treat and prevent malnutrition would spread by word of mouth and by example in rural communities throughout Uganda. Originally, it was hoped that mothers would return to their villages from the Mwanamujimu unit and begin to spread their new knowledge of how to prevent severe malnutrition among their peers. However, it was soon realized that mothers of once malnourished children were not as influential role models as initially thought, and efforts were increasingly directed towards women who already served as community leaders and could more effectively disseminate knowledge of how to prepare chitobro and promote nutritional health. Aptly known as influencers, these women became a fundamental component of the nutrition rehabilitation program and its extension into the rural areas beyond the reach of the central Mwanamujimu unit. Oral testimony collected in the region surrounding Lutete, the first rural health center to adopt the program, indicated that Mwanamujimu and the preparation of chitobro have had an enduring impact upon daily life and social practice. The women and men I interviewed spoke at great length about their ability to prevent malnutrition as a result of their knowledge and expertise in the preparation of chitobro. According to Kasifa Chune, Mwanamujimu was responsible for, and I quote, big changes in this area, and that is why you see that there are no longer children suffering from malnutrition, end of quote. Many of the women I interviewed in the region surrounding Lutete discussed the importance of preparing Chitobro and their memories of the Mwanamujimo program at great length. Robina Nenteza, for instance, proudly recounted how she prepared Chitobro for 11 years and never once, she claimed, had a child suffer from malnutrition. And this, as she pointed out, was despite the fact that she had to work on neighboring Buganda or farms in order to pay her children's school fees following her husband's death. Nearly all of the women I interviewed reported that they prepared Chitobro for their own children, and if their testimony can be considered representative, which I think is still an important question, it would appear that children who grew up in the region around Lutete were fed Chitobro as a matter of course. With only a few exceptions, the elderly women in the area around Lutete incorporated Chitobro into their daily meal preparation as a weaning food intended to maintain nutritional health. Chitobro became a standard diet for their young children and a feature of their daily meal preparation. In fact, only 2 of the women interviewed for this study indicated that they began to prepare Chitobro as a curative measure for already malnourished children. Moreover, these women believed in Mwanamujimo. If the certificates that they received after completing their Mwanamujimo training were not lost during the Bush War in the 1980s, they were kept as valued possessions. Nabanja Kolole, for instance, had her certificate framed and hanging with her family photographs on her living room wall. Women who underwent training at Mwanamujimo, either as future influencers or as mothers of once malnourished children, also formed and joined Mwanamujimo clubs. And to the extent that the preparation of Chitobro did become a widespread practice, it is testament to the ongoing work of these influential women. Their commitment to Mwanamujimo reflects the curative and preventive efficacy of Chitobro and their desire to improve nutritional health in Uganda, but it also explicitly built upon a significant expansion in women's groups and clubs beginning in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Women who were already involved in women's clubs and organizations were invited to spend time at the unit in Kampala learning the principles of the program and witnessing for themselves how mothers could treat and prevent malnutrition by preparing Chitobro. Many of these women then formed Mwanamujimo clubs within their own communities. In the area around Lutete, members of a Mwanamujimo club participated in Chitobro demonstrations at the Lutete Health Center every Wednesday for decades. With transportation often organized and provided by the local Maruka chief, these women traveled around to neighboring regions in order to spread knowledge of Chitobro preparation even further afield. Robina Nenteza, for example, first learned how to prepare Chitobro while attending a demonstration organized by the local Mwanamujimo club in a village a short distance from Lutete. One of the elderly women who I interviewed had been an active member of a Mwanamujimo club in Lutete until 1994, and she shared pictures of herself with her fellow club members during our conversation. What is more, Florence Mukasa was so dedicated to Mwanamujimo that she reportedly continued to instruct young women in the preparation of Chitobro until 2002, the year that she died. In fact, people in the region surrounding Lutete, recognizing her deep commitment to the program, began to refer to Florence as Mwanamujimo, and she continued to be remembered by this nickname several years after her death, which was a point of some confusion when I arrived in Lutete and began asking about Mwanamujimo, and everybody kept telling me she was dead. Although most of the women I interviewed are now grandmothers, they have passed their knowledge of how to prepare Chitobro onto their daughters so that they can prevent malnutrition in the next generation. As a result of this instruction from mother to daughter, even very young mothers in the region have knowledge of how to prepare Chitobro and plan to feed their children this mixture in order to promote nutritional health during the challenging period of weaning. There are several factors that have played a part in the successful implementation of this minor innovation in infant feeding, including, as I've indicated, the efficacy of Chitobro and the ease of its preparation. Moreover, the Mwanamujimo unit in Kampala continues to instruct women in the principles of preparing Chitobro, and together with influencers like Florence Mukasa, have kept the message of Mwanamujimo alive. And this is no small feat. The Nutrition Rehabilitation Program had been operating for just under a year when Uganda's first Prime Minister, Milton Obote, repealed the constitution, abolished Buganda and the other kingdoms, and declared a state of emergency that remained in effect until Idi Amin's coup in 1971. Moreover, Amin's notorious dictatorship was marked by a crippling retreat in medical provision, in which medical supplies dwindled and eventually became so scarce that the Nutritional Research Unit that had been established in the early 1950s was no longer able to even perform basic biochemical tests. As Lutete is both near to one of the Kabaka or the king of Buganda's palaces and within the notorious Luwero Triangle where civilians bore the brunt of Obote's anti-guerrilla campaign during the Bush War of the 1980s. This region in particular saw excessive violence during both periods of Uganda's post-colonial crisis. And the current state of the Lutete Health Center, therefore, reflects this more recent history of violence and upheaval. Yet what the decrepit state of the health center conceals is the extent to which Mwana-Mujimu continues to be part of the living memory and the social practice of both young and old in the area surrounding Lutete. The remarkable resilience of Mwana-Mujimu is therefore a reflection of the ingenuity of the program and the meanings that Mwana-Mujimu came to have in the lives of program participants. As intended, Mwana-Mujimu became a truly local program, dependent upon local adoption and advocacy rather than international donors and national institutions. It was mothers and other participants in the Mwana-Mujimu program who gave meaning to the message of Mwana-Mujimu as they worked to prevent malnutrition in their communities and across generations. When donor funding and public health services disintegrated under Amin, the Mwana-Mujimu program survived, sustained by women who had a stake in Mwana-Mujimu and who, as members of Mwana-Mujimu clubs and organizations, continued to spread the Mwana-Mujimu message throughout Uganda. It was their engagement with the program that transformed the philosophy behind nutrition rehabilitation into a viable and sustainable program of prevention in Uganda. This then leads to an important question. What were the meanings that Uganda ascribed to the nutrition rehabilitation program, and what meaning did the program come to have in their lives? This is then the more speculative part of my work. My own analysis indicates that part of Mwana-Mujimu's success may have been due to the fact that the program suggested an expanded role for mothers in child health. The philosophy of the nutrition rehabilitation program drew upon the Luganda proverb, Mwana-Mujimu ava ku ngozi, which, as already noted, is commonly translated to mean that a healthy child comes from a healthy mother. As a close analysis of the proverb reveals, a number of subtle meanings embedded within this particular axiom outlining the role of motherhood in Uganda society. The final word of the proverb, ngozi, refers specifically to the bark cloth or sling that mothers used to carry infants and young children on their backs prior to weaning. Yet ngozi also signifies the amniotic membranes in which an unborn fetus developed. And if the membranes didn't break and were not broken during childbirth by the attending doctor or midwife, an infant might still be born enclosed within the amniotic sac or ngozi. In Uganda cultural ideology at the turn of the century, when so many of our earliest sources were written, the role of mothers in child health and welfare was predominantly centered on the period of a child's life that preceded weaning and the naming ceremony. As part of the weaning process, Uganda mothers not only ceased breastfeeding, but no longer slept in the same bed or carried their newly weaned children in a sling or ngozi. Children who had been weaned were also ideally sent to live with and be raised by relatives, preferably the paternal aunt or grandmother. Weaning in Uganda society therefore signaled far more than just an end to breastfeeding. As an essential preliminary to the naming ceremony, weaning marked the end of this important phase of Uganda motherhood. It is thus that ngozi is translated as a direct reference to motherhood, to the period from conception through weaning, in which the life of a developing fetus and young child was, as the proverb states, seen as dependent upon close and constant contact with the mother. In Buganda, Mwana-Mujimu ava ku ngozi spoke to the central role of mothers in child health and well-being prior to weaning, because once a child was weaned, they became officially recognized members of their father's clan, and their health became the responsibility of patrilineal relatives, and especially the paternal aunt or senga. The crucial role of the senga in child health and welfare was perhaps most evident in the naming ceremony that established a child's clanship and paternity. Moreover, clanship was essential to physical and social well-being in Buganda because, as in many African societies, the spirits of dead ancestors were seen as directly responsible for the health and prosperity of their living descendants. As part of the naming ceremony, newly weaned children were given the name of an ancestor in order to demonstrate respect and ensure the ancestor's ongoing remembrance. Women, in their capacity as the paternal aunt or senga, chose the child's clan name and publicly announced the child's official membership in the father's clan. The principal role of the senga in the naming ceremony is indicative of her importance throughout a child's life. As the anthropologist Lucy Mayer wrote in the early 1930s, and I quote, "Of all the relatives among whom the child grew up, the one whom he was taught to treat with the most respect was the father's sister," end of quote. Thus, children addressed their senga using the same masculine terms of deference otherwise reserved for their fathers. Women, as basenga, participated in marriage rites and had particular influence upon a child's education and upbringing. Premarital instruction for young women was the exclusive purview of the senga. More importantly, the power of the senga over child health was such that she was seen as the only living relative who could cause a child's death. This power only increased when she became an ancestor, and ill health in young children was frequently attributed to the aggrieved spirit of the paternal aunt. In this light, Wanamujimu Avakungozi conveys a thinly veiled warning to patrilineal kin that their rights over children were not exclusive, and that claims upon children should not, moreover, be made until after a child had been weaned and could be separated from his or her mother. In other words, the proverb Wanamujimu Avakungozi suggests that motherhood and a mother's role in child health and rights over children was contested and shifting terrain. In insisting that mothers were essential to child health beyond the period of weaning, the Wanamujimu program advocated an expansion in the authority of the mother and represented a diminished position for women as basenga, or paternal aunts, and clan-based forms of authority. It is therefore essential to appreciate that the Wanamujimu program also took root in Uganda in the context of larger changes in Uganda society, in which greater emphasis was placed upon motherhood and the role of women as mothers. Many of the young mothers and fathers who participated in the Wanamujimu program in the mid to late 1960s were, for instance, second and third generation Christians. It was their parents and grandparents who first encountered the missionary emphasis upon the role of Christian women as wives and mothers. Moreover, as the site of one of the Church Missionary Society's maternity and child welfare clinics, Lutete had long been a regional center of medical missionary efforts to refashion motherhood and encourage women to focus on improving their skills as mothers. From the local perspective, the importance of the Wanamujimu placed upon motherhood and women's roles as mothers therefore represented a continuity rather than a break with the original teachings of the Lutete Maternity and Child Welfare Clinic. Christian messages of mothercraft were further popularized, particularly in the rural areas with the proliferation of women's clubs and organizations. The director of the Wanamujimu unit, Gladys Stokes, was and many of her colleagues were deeply committed Christians. Florence Mukasa and her husband were also motivated, apparently, to serve the community primarily as a result of their Christian faith. By mid-century, the freedom to convey property at will meant that lineage and clan control of land and people, which had been in decline throughout the colonial period, had begun to give way to new familial relations and land ownership patterns. In her 1956 study of the changing structure of Uganda village, for example, the anthropologist Audrey Richards found that, I quote, the new type of landholding made for increased dependence of sons and daughters on their parents and a general strengthening of the individual family unit, end of quote. The growing emphasis upon the immediate family and motherhood is particularly evident in changing land inheritance practices. Evidence collected in 1965 found that women who were increasingly acquiring and inheriting land in this period went to great lengths to subvert former precepts of inheritance in order to pass their land on to their own children. Customary inheritance practices dictated that in their capacity as basenga, a woman's heir, or musika, was her patrilineal reckoned niece or younger sister, a practice that kept her property within her clan. By the second half of the 20th century, many Ganda women were successfully able to ensure that their children did inherit their property, even though their land was thereby transferred to members of a different clan, and often had to be granted to their children or chosen heirs in advance of their death. Given that rights in land and people were at stake, not all welcomed the growing importance of motherhood in Ganda society. And I'm going to quickly skip to the end because I'm sure I'm rapidly running out of time. So there were conflicts over these land inheritance practices in particular that we could point to. But it was in this context that Wanamujimu emerged as a local program of prevention. When a malnourished child was brought to Wanamujimu, the attending relative, whether their mother, father, grandmother, or senga, as they approached the unit, they saw the main mural stretched across the opposing wall, and this was the entrance of the unit at this time. The center of the mural depicts a Ganda mother seated and breastfeeding her infant. At either side of the breastfeeding mother, 2 healthy but only recently weaned children stand, and surrounding the central image are older children in school uniforms and 2 seated adults. The key placement of high-protein components of the local diet, including chickens and eggs and beans, aim to impress upon visitors to the unit the importance of these particular sources of dietary protein. The image of the breastfeeding mother seated together with her newly weaned child became the emblem of Mwanamujimu, reproduced on calendars and certificates that women received after completing their training. This emblem then adorned the walls in the homes of people who participated in the Mwanamujimu program. From the biomedical perspective, the emblem served to underscore the importance of breastfeeding. Yet the impact of this image went beyond its intended value for public and international health. In light of the nuanced meanings embedded within the proverb Mwanamujimu ava kuongozi and the shifting importance of motherhood in Uganda society, an image intended to promote breastfeeding also inadvertently endorsed the ongoing importance of the mother in the health of the newly weaned child by her side. The nutrition rehabilitation program succeeded, I would argue, because it reinforced the centrality of motherhood and mothers and child health beyond the period of weaning at a moment in Ugandan history when many Ganda sought to assert and emphasize the role of mothers in motherhood and child health and in the future of Buganda. Despite the political turmoil that began to unfold only a year after Mwanamujimu opened its doors and the Lutete Health Center embarked upon a brief period of expansion, the nutrition rehabilitation program proved to be a sustainable program of prevention because it became a Ugandan program that was easily shaped to coincide with the aims and aspirations of a young generation of mothers and fathers in Buganda. To me, this suggests the need to look beyond the colonial and missionary efforts to domesticate African women into proper Victorian roles as wives and mothers in order to ask how Uganda interpreted these messages and efforts according to their own dynamic social ideologies and practices of motherhood, clanship, and health. And that's where I'll stop today. I hope I've left a little bit of time for questions, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Yes?
What happened? Was there suddenly a lot less food available, or did they forget nutritional practices, or is this prevalent throughout history?
So this is a matter of much debate, right? And is also a difficult question for us to answer for a couple of unfortunate reasons. And that is that we don't have very good evidence of prevalence rates, right? So physicians and scientists, namely the ones that I look at, came into Uganda assuming that this had been endemic, that this had been a problem that had always been there, right? You know, coming to the situation armed with their ideas that that Africa was a static place that had no history. Now, I would question that, but without evidence about shifting prevalence rates, I can only problematize that perception, right? But it's still an important question, and I think, but again, it's very difficult with the evidence that we have available. I think that the economic constraints that I spoke about in terms of the insurrection indicate, I think, the kind of constraints that people had in terms of accessing costly sources of protein. So, for instance, during that period of World War II, beef was in short supply, and the inflation costs of meat were extreme, and we do have evidence of that. Items like groundnuts were being shipped to Kenya and then abroad. So we can infer that that there were issues of scarcity together with cash crop production. But again, we're not able to as definitively answer that question, primarily because physicians weren't asking those questions. People weren't. They just assumed that this had been a problem that had always been there in the way that they saw it, that this wasn't a changing circumstance, right? Does that? Go, and then Alfredo, go ahead.
I kind of have a question more about timeline and neurology. So in 1949 they had the insurrection, and then they kind of stopped the whole treatment because there was a lot of, I guess, cultural backlash against it. And then
they stopped the experimentation. There was no treatment, right?
But they continued treating people.
So literally they had no effective treatment at this time.
Okay.
They tried a lot of things that were not very effective.
Okay. And when did Dr. Rex come in?
Dean. So he arrives in Uganda, and by 1952, he's publishing in the Lancet that he's developed an effective form of treatment.
Okay, and then, so this continued, and then when was it finally implemented that mothers were like cooking the chitobro for their kids? And
that program began in 1965.
Okay, so between like up until through the 60s and 70s, that's when it really started getting steam.
Yes.
Okay.
But you have to keep in mind, right, that in 1973, all the expatriates leave, right? And so basically this program is more or less forgotten outside of Uganda. Most people assume that it doesn't exist anymore, or they don't know about it. So picking up steam under the circumstances, right, which were pretty dire at the time in the 70s under Amin. Does that help explain that? Yeah? Can I just say one thing in regards to that? Yeah. Part of what helps us to understand, so Dean knew a lot about infant feeding, and that was a key component of this. But the other crucial part of this story was that at that time, and I didn't address this at all here, but at that time there was quite a lot of dried skim milk that was available as a waste food in the manufacture of butter, for instance, after World War II. And it's that dried skim milk and the ready availability of that dried skim milk that Dean uses to create an effective therapeutic formula. Prior to that time, they also they not only didn't know what caused the condition and how to treat it, but they also didn't have very much to work with, right? So those things come together in the 50s in a particular way. Alfredo?
So I guess two-part question. One is about the origins of this treatment that Dean developed. He came out of that, out of where did that originate? Where was the beginning of that treatment? Was that something that he dreamed one day, or was it a result of years of prior research that had been going on in the center that allowed him to sort of find the missing ingredient or something along those lines? And the second question I want to ask you is about the sort of the spread of these local cuisine, if you can call it that way, outside of the study area that you focused on. So, given that it's so readily spread within that small region, can we assume as well that that was a formula that was developed and exported to other parts of Uganda as well, fairly quickly?
Yes. Okay. So, to answer your question about the development of the formula, which I partly actually began to speak to, but Dean was actually working with key nutritional scientists out of a Cambridge group in Germany at the end of World War II, right, in the context of the massive undernutrition and malnutrition in Germany. And so he began working on developing vegetable sources of vegetable mixtures that were helping orphan children from the war. That's where his expertise in that developed. And then he essentially had a falling out with them, and that's when the MRC realized they had this key expert and that his work could be applied to this context in Uganda. So he had some expertise in this, and his aim all along was to reproduce that work, right? To find locally available sources of vegetable protein in Uganda that would allow him to create a local high protein mixture, which that's the part that failed. He could never find anything that reproduced the therapeutic efficacy of dried skim milk, which is why today that is still the form of treatment, leaving the plumpy nut issue aside. So the second question is a bit more tricky in that chitobro is both kind of, it has its local resonance right within the Luganda language, which I talked about in speaking to with etymology. So I have always, or not always, I've for long assumed that this was very, going to be very only applicable in Buganda, and have been surprised to meet East Africans far, in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam even, in Zanzibar, who knew knew about Mwanamujimu somehow. And I was kind of like, what? Literally struck by that. So what I can say is that in the early 1970s, like just before they were planning, just before everyone basically had to inconspicuously begin to leave, they were working to develop, they had a new program that they were launching in the far north of Uganda in a very different cultural context. And they were working with the local foods there, like there's a sesame bun kind of mixture that had long been used there. And so there were moves in the direction of kind of using the basic philosophy, but recognizing that the content itself always had to come from the local area. At least that was the expatriate vision. But I think, unfortunately, it's impossible to fully answer that question because of the political context and because everything shrank instead of continuing to grow and expand, beginning in the early 70s, we don't know. Right, and today Mwana Mujimu is still there, and I went to Lutete thinking that there would be nothing there. I would go there once, and nobody would know what I was talking about, and I would leave, and was very surprised with what I found. But I don't think that that's the case everywhere, and I think Mwana Mujimu is very much it's not what it was planned to be. It's like what could maintain, given the context. And then the other component of that is not just the political turmoil that ensued, but also a very profound switch in research interests. So in many ways, protein malnutrition was the big international issue of the 1950s and 1960s, where WHO people would talk about this being the protein decade, right? Now, at Malago, there's this enormous HIV/AIDS research center, and Mwana Mujimu further up the hill is this kind of forgotten, underfunded, they don't even have a car, so, does that, that kind of,
Yes, just a quick follow-up. So
yeah.
There's no evidence that other centers were created in other parts of Uganda doing similar type of work? Or
So like Lutete, in Buganda, there were other outreach centers, so other health facilities adopted the program, yes. And yes, none of the outlying centers could maintain through the Amin and other periods of turmoil. But what I think my research, so that's based on the infrastructure, right? The centers didn't maintain, but Lutete also doesn't maintain its Mwana Mujimu program. It's the people who can keep it alive. And so to really answer that question would entail going to each of those areas and asking the people about whether or not they continue to prepare Titobro. And what was striking to me on that front was when I met women who were younger than myself, who didn't have children of weaning age, who would tell me that they were going to prepare Titobro. And that was, that's a lot of transmission of knowledge over time in a place where people are not returning to, kind of encourage people to adopt something, right? Does that? Yes?
I'm interested to know if you can put any link between the representation of cultural representation of the disease, with when it became spread, in the late 40s, in the 50s. Do you have any evidence from the population about the explanation of the disease out of, what you can pick up, like a product of malnutrition, do you have any cultural explanation, from the local population?
Right. So this gets into chupa, which I didn't talk about, right? So I think part of your question is about shifting, like the growth of this as a problem or not, and that I can't speak to. And any effort that I made, perhaps I was asking the wrong questions, I think, at times, but to try and get at whether or not people saw shifting prevalence rates didn't lead to much, except that people would say it was much worse during Amin, for instance, so they would attach it to these political crises. But the other part of your question, so within, there's this biomedical understanding of this condition as kwashiorkor, as this single unified syndrome, particularly in this period that was firm. Within sort of Ganda conceptions of the illness, there were a variety of different conditions within the kind of Ganda lexicon of disease and diagnosis that biomedical physicians translated as kwashiorkor. So they translated them as misunderstandings that really are kwashiorkor. And there are numerous cultural explanations behind the disease. And I could talk about a couple of them. So one of them is Omusana. Well, the Omusana Obulungi, for instance, and this has to do with, and has relevance to what I talked about today, which is that a child who is still breastfeeding and together with the mother when the mother becomes pregnant again, and thus the causal factor is seen as the heat of the second pregnancy. And so this is part of the solution to that, is sending the child to live with the Senga. There are several others. Some of them involve spirits infecting children in the night, and so women needed to cover them up. And so this is another reason why children develop this condition during weaning periods, because that's when women stop sleeping with their children and thus are not keeping them covered in the night. And so what's interesting to me, I think, is that this is when people begin to see that there's this effective biomedical therapy and begin to bring their children now readily to the hospital to acquire this treatment, they don't say, oh, our prior understandings of this condition were wrong. They say, oh, there's this new condition that we didn't have a name for before because it didn't have a therapy. And so that's in the context in which chupa is added to these other conceptions of the illness. It does not replace them, which I think is really, really important to understand in appreciating this condition. It gets hard, though, for me to ask questions about this because some people remember chupa, but they don't remember. I didn't find people who could talk to me about a pre-chupa time. At least not. It was difficult for me to try to sort of say, talk to me about before there was this concept of chupa. The elderly people I'm speaking to wouldn't have been really old enough. They were young mothers post-chupa. So they don't have, and fathers, so they don't have a real definitive memory of the time when we didn't have this concept of chupa. And now they speak in terms of kwashiorkor, right? And so they've added these various, but they still think that a child, a child can still become infected with Omusana Obulungi, in which case, in that context, the first thing to do is to send your child to live, away from a pregnant mother. And people have not completely replaced those conceptions. It's just, if that doesn't work, then you might think, well, then that's not the condition, and maybe it's chupa, or maybe it's kwashiorkor.
Is an ancient kingdom with a long tradition, cultural tradition, political tradition, and institutions. I'm just wondering if there is any documentation, from local chronics,
Yes.
Which might help
Yes.
to understand the situation before the colonial time.
And I've mined I've spent many hours looking through some of the old accounts by Opala Kwagwa, for instance, to see. And there are some references that I can infer are references to, but there wasn't a lot written about childhood illness. Most of those were political accounts. And so there are little things that I can take from that, but to get a definitive picture prior to, at some level, because Mwanamujimu and then before that the biomedical therapy was so effective, memories of a pre-biomedical time in the context of this one condition are not really, even in people who you might consider outside of the kind of biomedical frame, they're not, at the forefront. They're not predominant, and they've added this. It's become part of the local conception of illness, and has been fit within conceptions of illness in a real kind of substantive way. But I understand the question you're asking is crucially important, and I wish that there was a real direct way of accessing it.
Yeah, because we should be related to end-use treatment for illness,
Yes.
But the question is how, what was used as a local treatment, before the colonial time, as long as it was not directly related to the colonial time, but it just spread in a time in which we have severe draft, severe malnutrition during that time. But before that, the illness was there.
Right, right. Like it's difficult to classify. No, I.
That's a good question.
I wish. I wish I could say more. Do we have time for another question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you just spell Chitobro and the name of the clinic for me?
Yeah.
Or is it online somewhere?
I don't think so. So Chitobro is spelled, it's Kitobero. Is it Ki in Luganda is Chi? That's why it's spelled Chitobro. And then Wanamugimu is Mwanamugimu. Wanamugimu, as precisely as it sounds. No problem. Is that it? Well, thank you, those who stayed through the question.